At my daughter's wedding reception, I was about to sit down when Ryan, her new husband, suddenly yanked the chair away. I crashed to the marble floor with a thunderous thud that echoed through the entire ballroom. "You should be more careful. Older folks tend to slip easily," he sneered, while 200 guests watched in horrified silence. What Ryan didn't know was that someone in that ballroom held a secret that would change everything. Before we continue, hit subscribe and let me know in the comments where you're watching from. The ballroom sparkled with fairy lights and white roses, exactly the way Emily had dreamed since she was 12. I adjusted my tie for the third time, my calloused hands still unfamiliar with formal wear after 30 years of working with wrenches and engine oil. The reception was in full swing, and I'd been watching from the sidelines as my daughter danced her first dance as Mrs. Blake. Her wedding dress caught the light beautifully, the same way her mother's had 28 years ago. The champagne glass in my hand felt foreign and delicate, like everything else in this upscale Manhattan venue. I'd insisted on paying for what I could afford, but Ryan's family had clearly taken over most of the arrangements. The mahogany chair behind me was part of an elegant dining set that probably cost more than my monthly pension. I could smell the fresh leather of the seat cushions mixed with the heavy scent of white lilies that dominated every table centerpiece. The crystal glasses around the room caught the chandelier light, creating tiny rainbows that danced across the white tablecloth. I'd chosen to sit at this particular table because it gave me a clear view of Emily without being too close to Ryan's business associates, who'd been eyeing my off-the-rack suit all evening. The soft murmur of sophisticated conversation filled the air, punctuated by the gentle clinking of expensive silverware. My daughter looked radiant, but something in Ryan's expression during their dance had made my chest tighten with an unease I couldn't quite name. "Time to make room for the real family," Ryan's voice cut through my thoughts as he approached from behind. I turned to see him straightening his designer tuxedo, his smile sharp and calculated rather than warm. The way he said "real family" made my jaw clench, but I forced myself to remain calm for Emily's sake. I'd noticed this pattern over the past 6 months, little comments that seemed innocent on the surface, but carried a darker undertone. His investment broker confidence had always felt more like arrogance to me, especially when he talked about upgrading Emily's life. The scent of his expensive cologne mixed unpleasantly with the floral arrangements as he moved closer. Something about his posture, the way he held his shoulders too straight, reminded me of a cat preparing to pounce. I started to lower myself toward the chair, my 60-year-old knees protesting after hours of standing and greeting guests. The smooth mahogany felt cool under my fingertips as I steadied myself, thinking about how proud my late wife Martha would have been to see Emily in her wedding dress. Just as my weight began to settle, I felt the chair jerk violently backward with a sharp scraping sound against the marble floor. My center of gravity shifted too quickly, and suddenly I was falling, my arms windmilling uselessly as gravity took hold. The world tilted sideways, and I crashed to the floor with a thunderous thud that seemed to echo through the entire ballroom. The champagne glass shattered somewhere beside me, its crystal fragments scattering across the polished marble like tiny diamonds catching the light. The silence that followed felt heavier than my impact with the floor. I could hear my own heartbeat pounding in my ears as I lay there, my hip throbbing and my pride bruised worse than my body. A few uncomfortable chuckles rippled through the crowd, the kind of nervous laughter that happens when people don't know how to react to someone else's misfortune. Ryan stood above me, still holding the chair he'd yanked away, his expression a mask of feigned concern that didn't reach his cold blue eyes. "You should be more careful. Older folks tend to slip easily," he said with a sneer that made my blood run cold. The condescension in his voice was unmistakable now, no longer hidden behind polite pretenses. I watched as several guests shifted uncomfortably, their faces showing a mixture of pity and second-hand embarrassment that cut deeper than any physical pain. Emily appeared at my side in a rush of white silk and pearls, her face drained of all color as she knelt beside me on the marble floor. Her hands trembled as she reached out to help me, her wedding makeup already starting to smear from tears she was trying desperately to hold back. "Dad? Oh my God. Are you okay?" she whispered, her voice cracking with emotion. I could see the conflict in her eyes, torn between helping her father and not wanting to cause a scene at her own wedding reception. The weight of the moment pressed down on all of us, and I realized that every guest in that ballroom was watching, their pity tangible in the air like a suffocating blanket. As I struggled to sit up, my worn suit jacket torn at the shoulder, I caught a glimpse of satisfaction flickering across Ryan's face before he quickly rearranged it into false concern. I pushed myself up from the cold marble floor, my hip screaming in protest with each movement. The silence in the ballroom felt thick enough to cut with a knife, broken only by the soft rustle of expensive fabric as guests turned to stare. My hands found the edge of a nearby table, and I used it to steady myself, the white tablecloth bunching under my grip. Emily's eyes were wide with horror, her bouquet forgotten on the floor beside the scattered champagne glass fragments. I could feel dozens of pairs of eyes boring into me, some filled with pity, others with that uncomfortable second-hand embarrassment that makes people look away. The fairy lights above suddenly felt too bright, casting harsh shadows across faces that had been warm and welcoming just moments before. "I'm fine," I said quietly, brushing off my torn jacket sleeve where a small piece of crystal had snagged the fabric. My voice came out steadier than I felt, years of dealing with difficult customers at the shop having taught me to keep my composure when others expected me to break. Emily started to protest, her mouth opening to say something, but I caught her eye and gave her the same look I'd used when she was little and about to argue with a teacher. The last thing she needed was her father causing more of a scene at her own wedding reception. I straightened my tie, which had twisted during the fall, and smoothed down my gray hair with a hand that barely trembled. The taste of humiliation was bitter in my mouth, but I swallowed it down like medicine. Ryan stood there with his arms crossed, that same cold smile playing at the corners of his mouth as if he was watching an amusing television show. "Really, Thomas, you should watch where you're going," he said, his voice carrying just enough volume for the nearby tables to hear. His tone was perfectly calibrated, concerned enough to sound innocent, condescending enough to twist the knife deeper. I watched his eyes as he spoke, and there was nothing accidental about the calculation I saw there. He adjusted his cufflinks with deliberate precision, a gesture that somehow managed to draw attention to the expensive watch on his wrist. The way he said my name, like he was talking to a child or a particularly slow employee, made my jaw tighten. But I said nothing, because Emily was watching, and her happiness mattered more than my pride. "Dad, are you sure you're okay?" Emily whispered, her voice so quiet I almost didn't hear it over the resumed murmur of conversation. Her wedding dress had a small scuff mark now from where she'd knelt on the marble, and I felt a stab of guilt for ruining even that small detail of her perfect day. She glanced nervously between Ryan and me, her hands twisting her wedding rings, rings that had cost more than I made in 3 months. I could see the conflict written across her face as clearly as if she'd spoken it aloud, torn between defending her father and not wanting to confront her new husband in front of 200 guests. The pearl earrings I'd given her for her 18th birthday caught the light as she shook her head slightly, and I realized she was silently pleading with me not to make this worse. Her lower lip trembled just once before she caught herself. I walked slowly to another chair at the same table, each step deliberate and measured despite the pain shooting through my hip. The mahogany felt solid under my hands as I pulled it out, testing it slightly before sitting down with careful dignity. Around us, conversations gradually resumed, but I could feel the weight of stolen glances and whispered comments following me like shadows. A waiter appeared with a dustpan and small brush, efficiently cleaning up the broken crystal while studiously avoiding eye contact. The elderly woman at the next table leaned over to her husband and said something behind her hand, and I didn't need to hear the words to know what she was discussing. My worn leather shoes looked shabby against the polished marble, a reminder that I didn't belong in this world of crystal and gold-rimmed plates. The ache in my chest had nothing to do with the fall. Ryan straightened his bow tie and chuckled, the sound somehow managing to be both light and cruel at the same time. "Well, no harm done, right?" he announced to the nearby tables, spreading his hands in a gesture that was meant to look apologetic, but felt more like a magician revealing a successful trick. Several guests forced polite smiles and murmured agreement, but their discomfort was palpable in the way they avoided direct eye contact with me. He clapped his hands together once, the sharp sound cutting through the ambient conversation like a judge's gavel. "Let's get back to celebrating, shall we? This is supposed to be a party, after all." His voice carried the easy confidence of someone who had never doubted that others would follow his lead. I watched him scan the room, noting which guests were still watching our little drama, and which had successfully redirected their attention elsewhere. Emily stood frozen between us, her bouquet retrieved, but held so tightly that her knuckles had gone white against the white roses. "Ryan, maybe we should," she started, but he cut her off with a wave of his hand that looked casual, but felt dismissive. The hurt that flashed across her face was there and gone so quickly that anyone not watching closely would have missed it entirely. She looked down at her shoes, expensive white silk that probably cost more than my monthly grocery budget, and I saw her shoulders sag just slightly under the weight of unspoken words. The string quartet in the corner began playing again, filling the awkward silence with something light and forgettable. I realized that Emily was learning something about her new husband that she hadn't expected to discover on her wedding day, and the knowledge sat heavy in my chest like a stone. The guests around us began to move and mingle again, but their body language told a different story than their polite smiles. I caught fragments of whispered conversations as people passed by our table. Poor man. What kind of person? On her wedding day, no less. An older gentleman in a navy suit paused near our table, his eyes meeting mine for just a moment before he gave me the slightest nod, acknowledgement from one man to another that something wrong had just occurred. His wife tugged gently on his arm, pulling him away before he could say anything, but the gesture felt like solidarity in a room full of careful neutrality. I folded my hands in my lap, noticing how the calluses from 40 years of mechanical work looked against the pristine white tablecloth. The contrast felt like a metaphor for everything about this evening. But as I watched Ryan work the room, shaking hands and accepting congratulations with that same calculated charm, something cold settled in my stomach. The way he moved, the timing of his approach to my chair, the perfectly practiced expression of false concern, none of it was accidental. This wasn't just a cruel joke or a moment of poor judgment. I had the unsettling feeling that I was seeing the real Ryan Blake for the first time, and Emily had no idea what she'd just married into. The question that began to form in the back of my mind would haunt me for days. If he was willing to humiliate me this publicly, this casually, what was he planning to do when no one was watching? As I sat there watching Ryan charm the remaining guests, my mind drifted back to 3 nights ago at Romano's restaurant. The memory hit me like a punch to the gut, suddenly making sense in a way it hadn't at the time. I'd arrived 10 minutes early, as always, my best button-down shirt freshly pressed, and my hands scrubbed clean of the motor oil that never quite washed out completely. Emily had insisted on this dinner to discuss wedding details, though I suspected it was really Ryan's idea to establish some ground rules. The restaurant was the kind of place where they gave you cloth napkins, and the waiter described every ingredient in the specials. I'd felt out of place from the moment I walked through the door, but I was determined to make an effort for Emily's sake. Ryan had chosen the wine without consulting me, something French with a name I couldn't pronounce, and a price that made my pension check seem like pocket change. "Thomas will appreciate this vintage," he'd said to the sommelier, not bothering to ask if I even drank wine. I'd nursed the single glass through the entire meal, more concerned about the mounting bill than the taste of fermented grapes. Emily had looked beautiful in a blue dress I'd never seen before, probably something Ryan had bought her from one of those Manhattan boutiques, where they don't put price tags on anything. She'd spent most of the dinner mediating between Ryan's stories about his investment successes and my attempts at small talk about the garage. The tension in her shoulders told me she was working harder than she should have been on what was supposed to be a pleasant family dinner. When the check arrived in a leather portfolio that probably cost more than my monthly utility bill, Ryan had barely glanced at the total before sliding it directly across the white tablecloth toward me. The gesture was smooth, practiced, like he'd done it 100 times before with other people he considered beneath him. "It's tradition, isn't it?" he'd said, his voice light and casual, as if we were discussing the weather instead of a bill that represented nearly a quarter of my monthly income. "The bride's father pays." The way he emphasized tradition made it clear he wasn't talking about custom, but about putting me in my place. I'd reached for my wallet without argument, even though I knew I'd be eating beans and toast for the rest of the month. Emily had started to protest, her hand moving toward her purse, but Ryan had stopped her with just a look. "Dad, you don't have to," she'd begun, her voice soft with embarrassment. But I'd cut her off with a shake of my head. The last thing I wanted was for her to feel caught between her father's financial limitations and her fiancé's expensive tastes. I'd counted out the cash slowly, including a tip that was probably more generous than I could afford, while Ryan watched with that same calculating expression I'd seen at the wedding reception. The silence that followed had been thick with unspoken tension, broken only by the soft, classical music playing in the background. Emily had twisted her engagement ring around her finger, a nervous habit I'd noticed she'd developed since getting engaged. The diamond caught the candlelight, throwing tiny rainbows across the tablecloth that somehow made the moment feel even more surreal. The drive to Emily's apartment afterward had been quiet, with her staring out the passenger window at the Brooklyn streets where she'd grown up. When we'd pulled up to her building, Ryan was already there, leaning against his BMW like he owned the entire block. I'd helped Emily carry some wedding supplies upstairs, cardboard boxes filled with centerpieces and favor bags that she'd been working on for weeks. Her apartment was small but clean, filled with furniture she'd bought piece by piece from thrift stores and garage sales. The couch where I'd read her bedtime stories was still there, covered now with fabric samples and wedding magazines. Everything about the space spoke to careful budgeting and making do with what you had, values I'd raised her with, but that Ryan clearly didn't share. "We'll be moving to Manhattan after the honeymoon," Ryan had announced. Not to me, but to Emily, as if I wasn't standing right there holding a box of wedding decorations. His tone was matter-of-fact, like he was discussing a business decision rather than uprooting my daughter from everything familiar. "You won't have to go back to that run-down Brooklyn neighborhood anymore." The way he said "run down" made my chest tighten with a familiar ache, the same feeling I'd had watching other kids tease Emily about our modest house when she was in elementary school. This was her home, the place where she'd taken her first steps and learned to ride a bike, where her mother had sung lullabies, and where we'd celebrated every birthday and Christmas. To him, it was just something to be discarded and forgotten. Emily had set down the box she was carrying with more force than necessary, the contents rattling inside like broken promises. "Ryan, this is my home," she'd said, her voice steady, but her hands shaking slightly as she smoothed down her skirt. I could see her trying to find the right words, caught between loyalty to the place that had shaped her and excitement about her future with this man. The photographs on her refrigerator, pictures of us at her graduation, her mother's birthday parties, family barbecues in our small backyard, seemed to stare accusingly at all of us. Ryan had walked over to her kitchen window and looked out at the fire escape with the kind of expression people wear when they're examining something distasteful. His expensive shoes clicked against her worn linoleum floor, each step a small reminder that he didn't belong here. "Emily, sweetheart, you'll love the penthouse," he'd continued, completely ignoring her protest. "Floor-to-ceiling windows, doorman, view of Central Park. You'll never have to worry about break-ins or loud neighbors again." His voice carried that same dismissive tone he'd used at the restaurant, as if her concerns were childish rather than valid. I'd watched my daughter's face as he spoke, seeing the conflict play out in real time across her features. She'd glanced at me, then back at him, her mouth opening and closing as if she couldn't find words that wouldn't hurt someone she loved. The silence stretched between us like a chasm, filled with everything we weren't saying about class and money and the different worlds we came from. I'd stayed quiet through the entire exchange, my jaw clenched tight enough to make my teeth ache. Every instinct I had was screaming at me to defend our neighborhood, to point out that this run-down area had raised a daughter who was kind and hard-working and generous. But Emily was an adult now, engaged to be married, and the last thing she needed was her father starting a fight with her fiancé over something that couldn't be changed anyway. I'd learned long ago that sometimes love means swallowing your pride and letting the people you care about make their own choices, even when those choices feel like betrayals. The weight of that decision had settled in my chest like a stone, heavy and permanent, and impossible to ignore. But as I'd driven home that night, replaying the conversation in my head, something had nagged at me beyond the obvious insult. It wasn't just what Ryan had said, but how he'd said it, with the confidence of someone who knew exactly how his words would land and didn't care about the damage they might cause. The casual cruelty of it, the way he'd dismissed not just our neighborhood, but everything it represented, had felt deliberate and calculated. Now, sitting at this wedding reception with my torn jacket and bruised hip, I was beginning to understand that Ryan's contempt wasn't situational or accidental. It was systematic, methodical, and I had the sinking feeling that what I'd witnessed so far was just the beginning of a much larger and more dangerous pattern. The ballroom had settled into an uncomfortable rhythm when the heavy oak doors at the entrance swung open with enough force to make several guests turn their heads. A man in his mid-60s strode through, his military bearing unmistakable even in a perfectly tailored tuxedo that probably cost more than my car. His silver hair was combed back precisely, and his jaw carried the kind of tension that suggested he was already irritated about being late to his own son's wedding reception. This had to be Richard Blake, Ryan's father, the man I'd heard about but never actually met despite 6 months of wedding planning. Ryan had always made excuses about his father's busy schedule, important business trips, prior commitments that couldn't be moved. Now I understood why the guest list had been so carefully managed, why certain conversations had been steered away from family history and background stories. Richard's eyes swept the ballroom with the efficiency of someone accustomed to assessing situations quickly and completely. His gaze moved past the elaborate floral arrangements and crystal chandeliers, past the guests who were still whispering about my fall, past the dance floor where a few couples swayed to the string quartet's gentle melodies. When his eyes finally landed on me, still sitting stiffly in my replacement chair with my torn jacket sleeve and rumpled hair, everything about his expression changed. The irritation drained from his face, replaced by something that looked almost like shock, then recognition, then something deeper that I couldn't quite identify. His mouth opened slightly, as if he were about to speak, then closed again. His hand moved instinctively to his chest, pressing against his heart like he was checking to make sure it was still beating. "Thomas?" The word came out barely above a whisper, but in the relative quiet of the ballroom, it carried across the space between us like a gunshot. Several guests turned to look at him, then at me, trying to understand why the father of the groom was staring at the father of the bride with such intensity. Richard took a step forward, then stopped, his expensive shoes suddenly seeming unsteady on the polished marble floor. His face had gone pale beneath his tan, and I watched him swallow hard, his Adam's apple bobbing like he was trying to force down words that wanted to escape. The confusion in the room was palpable, but I felt my own chest tighten with a recognition that was 25 years old and buried under decades of ordinary life. I stood up slowly, my hip protesting, but my mind racing back to a construction site in Queens, to the smell of welding sparks and the sound of metal groaning under too much weight. Richard Blake. The name had been different then, or maybe I'd just never heard it clearly over the noise of machinery and shouting workers, but the face was unmistakable, even aged and refined by years of success and good living. This was the man I'd yanked away from a collapsing scaffold when a support cable snapped, the executive in the hard hat who'd been checking on a project when physics and bad luck nearly killed him. We'd both hit the ground hard, me on top of him, as 2 tons of metal crashed down exactly where he'd been standing 3 seconds earlier. "My God," Richard breathed, his voice stronger now, but shaking with emotion. "It is you." He moved toward me with purpose, his military training evident in the way he navigated between tables and guests without taking his eyes off my face. Ryan appeared at his father's elbow, his expression shifting from confusion to something that might have been alarm as he tried to understand what was happening. Emily was watching from across the room, her bouquet forgotten in her hands as she tried to piece together why her new father-in-law was looking at her father like he'd seen a ghost. The string quartet continued playing, but their music seemed to fade into background noise as the entire ballroom focused on this unexpected drama unfolding in front of them. "Dad, what's wrong?" Ryan asked, his voice carrying that same controlled tone he'd used when humiliating me earlier. But there was uncertainty underneath it now, a crack in his confidence that suggested he was realizing something was happening that he hadn't planned or anticipated. He reached out to touch his father's arm, but Richard shook him off without even looking at him. The dismissal was so complete, so focused, that Ryan actually took a step backward. I could see him trying to regain control of the situation, but for the first time all evening, he looked genuinely off balance. His perfect composure was starting to slip, and the guests were beginning to notice. Richard stopped about 3 feet away from me, close enough that I could see the tears gathering in his eyes. "Queens Construction, summer of 1999, he said, and suddenly I was back there, tasting concrete dust and hearing the screech of failing metal. "Building 47, the Morrison Project. You were working on the electrical systems." His voice was steady now, but thick with emotion, and I could see him fighting to maintain his composure in front of all these people. The details were flooding back. The heat that day, the way the scaffold had started to sway, the split second when I'd seen what was about to happen and moved without thinking. He'd been wearing a white hard hat, I remembered suddenly, the kind that marked him as someone important, someone who didn't usually get his hands dirty, but was there anyway. "The cable snapped," I said quietly, my own voice rougher than I'd expected. "You were checking the wiring conduits on level 3. The memory was crystallizing now, bringing with it the phantom ache in my shoulder where I'd landed wrong, the metallic taste of fear, the way he'd looked up at me afterward with gratitude and shock. We'd barely spoken that day. Paramedics had arrived, reports had been filed, and by the time the dust settled, he'd been whisked away by assistants and lawyers while I'd gone back to work. I'd never expected to see him again, never imagined that the executive I'd saved was connected to the man who'd just married my daughter. Richard's composure finally cracked, and a single tear rolled down his cheek before he wiped it away with the back of his hand. The ballroom had gone completely silent now, even the string quartet sensing that something momentous was happening. "You saved my life that day," he said, his voice carrying to every corner of the room. "Pulled me away from that scaffold 3 seconds before it came down. If it weren't for you—" He stopped, unable to finish the sentence, but everyone in that room understood what he meant. Ryan was staring at his father with an expression I'd never seen before, something between shock and horror, as if he was finally beginning to understand the magnitude of what had just happened. The weight of the moment settled over all of us like a heavy blanket, and I could feel the shift in the room's energy as surely as I could feel my own heartbeat. Emily had moved closer, her face reflecting the same bewilderment that was probably written across my own features. The guests who had been whispering about my earlier humiliation were now leaning forward, hungry for details about this unexpected revelation. Richard was looking at me with something approaching reverence, while Ryan's carefully constructed world was beginning to crumble around him. But what happened next would change everything in ways I couldn't have imagined. What Richard said next turned my humiliation into something else entirely. Richard Blake turned to face the entire ballroom, his military bearing returning as he straightened his shoulders and lifted his chin. "If it weren't for this man," he said, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to commanding attention, "I wouldn't be here today to witness my son's wedding." The words fell into the silence like stones into still water, creating ripples of understanding that spread from table to table. I watched faces change as the meaning sank in. The same guests who had pitied me 20 minutes ago were now looking at me with something approaching awe. The string quartet had stopped playing entirely now, their instruments resting in their laps as they strained to hear every word of this unexpected drama. The color drained from Ryan's face so quickly I thought he might faint. His mouth opened and closed several times, like a fish gasping for air, but no sound came out. The confident smirk that had been his signature expression all evening was gone, replaced by something raw and panicked. His hands, which had been so steady when pulling away my chair, now trembled visibly as he tried to process what his father had just revealed to 200 wedding guests. I could see him calculating, trying to find a way to spin this information to his advantage. But for once in his life, Ryan Blake appeared to be completely out of moves. The expensive tuxedo that had made him look so polished and untouchable now seemed like a costume that was falling apart at the seams. Emily's bouquet slipped from her fingers and hit the marble floor with a soft thud, white roses scattering around her feet like fallen stars. Her eyes moved back and forth between Richard and me, trying to reconcile the father she thought she knew with this revelation about heroism and life-saving courage. "Dad?" she whispered, the single word carrying 27 years of questions she'd never thought to ask. Her wedding makeup was starting to smudge as tears gathered in her eyes. But these weren't tears of joy or sadness. They were tears of recognition, of suddenly understanding that her quiet, humble father had depths she'd never suspected. The diamond earrings I'd given her for her 18th birthday caught the chandelier light as she shook her head in disbelief. Richard stepped closer to Ryan, close enough that his next words would be heard only by those in the immediate vicinity. But the acoustics of the ballroom carried his voice further than he probably intended. "You just humiliated the very man who saved my life," he said, his voice low but sharp enough to cut glass. "The man who threw himself between me and 2 tons of falling metal without a second thought. The man who risked his own life so I could come home to your mother that night." Each word was delivered like a physical blow, and I watched Ryan actually flinch backward with each accusation. The guests closest to us were leaning forward now, no longer pretending not to listen. The tables further away had gone completely quiet, everyone straining to catch fragments of this confrontation. "Do you understand how deep this shame runs?" Richard continued, his voice rising slightly as his control began to slip. "How it reflects not just on you, but on our entire family, on everything I tried to teach you about honor and respect and recognizing the worth of other people?" The military officer was showing through the businessman's polish now, and I could see where Ryan had learned his commanding presence. He'd just never learned how to wield it with honor instead of cruelty. Richard's jaw was clenched so tightly I could see the muscles working beneath his skin, and his hands were balled into fists at his sides. The disappointment radiating from him was almost palpable, filling the space between father and son, with 25 years of failed lessons about character. Ryan finally found his voice, though it came out as a hoarse whisper that was nothing like his earlier confident tones. "Dad, I didn't know," he stammered, glancing around at the circle of faces watching his humiliation unfold. "How could I have known? You never told me about any construction accident." His words sounded pathetic even to his own ears, and I could see him realize it as soon as they left his mouth. The excuse was weak, and they both knew it. Not knowing someone was a hero didn't excuse treating them with contempt and cruelty. Several guests near us were shaking their heads, their expressions reflecting the same disgust I'd seen on Richard's face. The elderly woman who'd whispered about me earlier was now glaring at Ryan with undisguised distaste. "That's not the point." Richard's voice cracked like a whip, loud enough now that every person in the ballroom could hear him clearly. "The point is that you chose to humiliate an older man at his own daughter's wedding. You chose cruelty over kindness, contempt over respect. You chose to reveal exactly what kind of person you are when you think no one important is watching." The accusations hung in the air like smoke, impossible to wave away or ignore. I could see Ryan's world crumbling around him in real time, his carefully constructed image falling apart under his father's relentless moral assault. The guests were no longer trying to be polite about their staring. This was better than any entertainment they could have hoped for. Emily moved toward us on unsteady legs, her wedding dress rustling against the scattered rose petals at her feet. "Ryan," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, but carrying clearly in the silence. "Is this true? Did you really pull away my father's chair on purpose?" The question was simple, but it carried the weight of everything their marriage would be built on: trust, respect, honesty, the basic human decency that should exist between people who claim to love each other. I watched Ryan's face as he realized this was his moment of truth, that whatever he said next would determine not just how this evening ended, but how the rest of his life would unfold. Ryan looked around the ballroom desperately, as if hoping to find some ally, some face that might offer him support or understanding. But every eye that met his was cold, disapproving, waiting for an explanation that could somehow justify what they'd all witnessed. "It was just a joke," he said finally, the words falling flat in the heavy air. "I was just trying to lighten the mood, have a little fun. You're all taking this way too seriously." But even as he spoke, I could see he knew it was too late. The damage was done, not just to his relationship with Emily, but to his reputation in front of everyone who mattered in his social and professional circles. The silence that followed was different from the earlier quiet. This was the silence of judgment, of a room full of people who had seen someone's true character revealed and found it wanting. Richard was still staring at his son with disappointment so profound it was almost painful to witness. Emily was looking at Ryan as if she was seeing him clearly for the first time. And what she saw was making her take small, unconscious steps backward. The guests were exchanging glances that spoke volumes about what this story would become at dinner parties and business meetings for months to come. But what Emily did next would shock everyone in that room, including me. The whispers started like a distant storm, building from table to table until they filled the ballroom with a low buzz of disapproval. I could hear fragments floating through the air. Shameful, disgusting, at his own daughter's wedding. The guests who had been so carefully polite during my humiliation were now openly staring at Ryan with undisguised contempt. Their eyes followed his every movement, cataloging his discomfort with the same intensity they might reserve for watching a particularly fascinating car accident. The elderly gentleman in the navy suit who had nodded at me earlier was shaking his head slowly, his mouth set in a thin line of disgust. His wife was whispering furiously behind her hand, her jewelry catching the light as she gestured emphatically toward Ryan. I stood up slowly, feeling the weight of every gaze in the room shift to me. My hip still ached from the fall, but I straightened my shoulders and smoothed down my torn jacket with as much dignity as I could muster. The silence was expectant now, waiting for my response to this public vindication. "I don't need an apology for myself," I said, my voice carrying clearly across the marble floor. The words came out steadier than I felt, decades of dealing with difficult situations at the garage having taught me the power of calm speech in moments of chaos. "I only want my daughter to know the value of respect." I looked directly at Ryan as I spoke, watching him flinch under the weight of my steady gaze. Emily's composure finally shattered completely. The tears she'd been holding back spilled over, running down her cheeks and leaving dark streaks in her carefully applied makeup. She moved toward me with stumbling steps, her wedding dress trailing behind her like a broken dream. "Dad," she sobbed, reaching for my hand with fingers that shook like autumn leaves. When her palm touched mine, I felt the tremor run through her entire body, the physical manifestation of everything she was trying to process. Her wedding ring caught the light as she clutched my hand, and I could feel the cool metal pressed between our joined fingers. The strength of her grip told me everything about how much she needed this anchor, this connection to something solid in a world that had just shifted beneath her feet. Richard turned away from Ryan as if he couldn't bear to look at his son any longer. "You've embarrassed yourself, our family, and everyone in this room," he said, his voice carrying the kind of authority that made grown men stand at attention. His military bearing was in full display now, shoulders back, chin up, every inch the commanding officer who had once led soldiers into battle. The disappointment radiating from him was so profound it seemed to create its own gravity field, pulling the attention of everyone in the ballroom toward this moment of paternal reckoning. I could see guests at nearby tables leaning forward, hungry to witness this public dismantling of someone they had thought was untouchable. From a table near the dance floor, an older woman rose to her feet with the kind of deliberate grace that suggested she was accustomed to commanding attention. Her silver hair was perfectly styled, and her black evening gown spoke of old money and older values. The diamond necklace at her throat caught the chandelier light as she turned to face Ryan, her expression cold enough to frost the windows. "Nancy Blake," someone whispered near me, and I realized this must be Richard's sister, the woman Emily had mentioned as being particular about family reputation. The family resemblance was unmistakable in the set of her jaw and the steel in her eyes. "This is a disgrace to the entire Blake family," Nancy announced, her voice carrying the kind of authority that came from generations of social prominence. Her words cut through the ballroom like a blade, silencing even the whispers that had been building around us. She stood with her hands clasped in front of her, every inch the society matriarch who had probably ended more than one career with a well-placed word of disapproval. In 40 years of attending weddings, charity galas, and social functions, I have never witnessed such appalling behavior from someone who claims to represent our family name. Each word was delivered with surgical precision, designed to inflict maximum damage on Ryan's already crumbling reputation. Ryan looked around the ballroom desperately, his eyes darting from face to face, searching for any sign of sympathy or support. But every expression he encountered was cold, judgmental, waiting for him to somehow explain away the inexplicable. His expensive tuxedo, which had made him look so powerful and confident earlier in the evening, now seemed to hang on him like a costume that no longer fit. "Aunt Nancy, please," he started, his voice cracking on the words. "You don't understand the full situation. There's context here that—" But she cut him off with a look that could have frozen fire, her hand rising in a gesture that brooked no argument. "There is no context," Nancy said, her voice sharp enough to cut crystal. "That justifies deliberately humiliating an elderly man at his own daughter's wedding. No explanation that makes cruelty acceptable. No excuse that transforms contempt into comedy." She paused, letting each word sink in like stones into deep water. "You have shown this room exactly who you are, Ryan. And it is not someone worthy of the Blake name or the woman standing beside you in that wedding dress." The silence that followed was so complete, I could hear the soft hum of the chandeliers overhead, the distant sound of traffic outside, the rapid breathing of my daughter as she stood clutching my hand. The guests were no longer even pretending to look away. This was social theater of the highest order, a public execution carried out with words instead of weapons. I could see phones being discreetly positioned, though no one was crude enough to openly record this moment. But I knew that by tomorrow morning, every detail of this confrontation would have spread through Ryan's social and professional circles like wildfire. The investment broker who had seemed so untouchable an hour ago was learning the hard way that reputation was the most fragile currency in high society. Emily was still crying, but her tears had changed quality. These weren't tears of shock or confusion anymore. They were tears of recognition, of finally seeing clearly something that had been hidden from her for too long. "How many other times?" she whispered, so quietly I almost didn't hear her. "How many other people have you treated like this when I wasn't watching?" The question hung in the air like smoke, impossible to wave away or ignore. Ryan's face went even paler, if that was possible, as he realized she was starting to connect dots he'd hoped would remain forever scattered. Richard shook his head slowly, the gesture carrying more condemnation than 1,000 angry words. "I raised you better than this," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, but somehow carrying to every corner of the ballroom. "Your mother and I gave you every advantage, every opportunity to become a man of character and honor. And this is what you've chosen to become." The pain in his voice was unmistakable, the sound of a father watching his son reveal himself as a stranger. The disappointment was so profound it seemed to age him before our eyes, adding years to his face in the space of a few sentences. Emily released my hand slowly, wiping her tears with the back of her wrist as she turned to face Ryan. The transformation in her posture was remarkable. Where moments before she had been clinging to me for support, now she stood with her spine straight and her chin lifted, every inch her mother's daughter. The resemblance to Martha in that moment was so strong, it took my breath away. The same quiet strength that had carried our family through every crisis we'd ever faced. Her wedding dress, which had looked so perfect and pristine at the beginning of the evening, now seemed like armor she was preparing to shed. The scattered rose petals at her feet crunched softly as she took a step toward her new husband, and I could see her hands trembling despite her determined expression. "Ryan," she said, her voice steady despite the tears still glistening on her cheeks. The single word carried the weight of 6 months of engagement, 2 years of courtship, and a lifetime of dreams that were crumbling in real time. Every guest in the ballroom seemed to lean forward slightly, sensing that they were about to witness something that would define the rest of this evening and possibly the rest of these people's lives. The string quartet had given up all pretense of providing background music, their instruments silent as they watched this drama unfold with the same fascination as everyone else. Even the waitstaff had stopped moving, frozen in place with their trays and towels as they watched the bride confront her groom. "A man who truly loves me would never humiliate my father," Emily continued, her voice growing stronger with each word. The statement landed in the silence like a physical blow, and I watched Ryan actually stagger backward as if she had struck him. There was no anger in her voice, no hysteria or dramatic flourishes, just the quiet certainty of someone who had finally seen the truth and could no longer unsee it. Her wedding makeup was ruined, dark streaks of mascara painting sad trails down her cheeks, but somehow she had never looked more beautiful or more dignified. The woman I had raised, the daughter I had tried to teach about self-respect and knowing her own worth, was finally standing up for both of us. Ryan's mouth opened and closed several times, but no sound emerged. His face cycled through expressions like a man drowning, shock, panic, calculation, desperation, as he tried to find some way to salvage what was clearly a lost cause. His perfectly styled hair was beginning to show signs of perspiration, and his bow tie sat slightly askew, small imperfections that somehow made his entire polished facade seem like the costume it had always been. I could see him struggling to access the charm and manipulation that had gotten him this far, but Emily was looking at him with the clear eyes of someone who would never be fooled again. The power dynamic that had defined their relationship for 2 years had shifted completely, and we could all see him scrambling to adapt to this new reality. Emily's hands moved to her left ring finger with deliberate precision, the motion so slow and measured it seemed choreographed. The enormous diamond engagement ring caught the chandelier light one last time as she twisted it off her finger, the gesture so final and decisive that several guests actually gasped audibly. She held the ring up briefly, examining it as if seeing it clearly for the first time, then set it down on the nearest table with a soft click that somehow seemed to echo through the entire ballroom. The wedding band followed immediately after, and I watched 2 years of promises and plans join the scattered rose petals on the marble floor. The symbolism was unmistakable, and the finality of the gesture sent a ripple of shock through the crowd. "Emily, wait!" Ryan finally found his voice, though it came out as a strangled whisper that bore no resemblance to his earlier confident tones. He lunged toward the table where she had placed the rings, his hand reaching out as if he could somehow undo what had just happened by grabbing the jewelry and forcing it back onto her finger. But Emily stepped smoothly out of his path, her movement graceful despite the heavy wedding dress and the emotional weight of the moment. The guests closest to us were openly staring now, their pretense of polite disinterest abandoned in favor of witnessing what was clearly a historic moment in their social circle. I could see phones being raised discreetly, though whether to capture the moment or call family members to share the gossip, I couldn't tell. "It was just a joke!" Ryan's voice cracked as he finally managed to string together a complete sentence. "You misunderstood me. I was trying to be playful, to break the tension, to make everyone laugh." The words tumbled out of him in a desperate rush, each excuse weaker than the last. His hands were gesturing wildly now, all trace of his earlier cool composure gone, as he tried to explain away the unexplainable. "Your father knows I was kidding, don't you, Thomas? Tell her it was just harmless fun." But when he turned to me with that desperate plea in his eyes, looking for any lifeline I might throw him, I simply stared back in silence. The man who had humiliated me 20 minutes ago was now begging for my help, and the irony was not lost on anyone in the room. Emily shook her head slowly, each movement deliberate and final. "No, Ryan," she said, her voice carrying a sadness that seemed to age her before our eyes. "A joke is something everyone laughs at. What you did to my father wasn't funny. It was cruel. It was calculated. And it showed me exactly who you really are when you think no one important is watching." The accuracy of her assessment was so precise, so cutting, that I saw Ryan actually wince as each word hit its mark. She had dissected his character with surgical precision, laying bare the ugliness that had been hidden beneath his polished exterior. The guests were nodding in agreement, their earlier sympathy for me now extending to Emily, as they watched her make what was clearly the most difficult decision of her life. Richard Blake stood in stunned silence, watching his son's marriage dissolve in real time. The military bearing that had sustained him through earlier confrontations seemed to desert him now, his shoulders sagging under the weight of watching his family's reputation crumble in the most public way possible. Nancy remained standing at her table, her expression unreadable, but her posture rigid with the kind of controlled fury that spoke to generations of breeding and social expectations. The other Blake family members were whispering among themselves, their faces reflecting varying degrees of shock, embarrassment, and damage control calculations. This wasn't just a failed wedding. It was a social catastrophe that would have repercussions for months or even years to come. The silence stretched between Emily and Ryan like a chasm that could never be bridged, filled with everything that would never be said and everything that could never be taken back. Ryan's face was cycling through the stages of grief in real time. Denial had given way to anger, which was now shifting toward bargaining, as he realized the full scope of what he was losing. But Emily had already moved beyond grief into acceptance, her decision made and her path forward clear, even if it led into an uncertain future. Emily turned toward me with tears streaming down her face, but for the first time all evening, they weren't tears of confusion or pain. They were tears of relief. She reached for my hand, her fingers finding mine with the same instinctive certainty she'd shown as a little girl crossing busy streets. "Dad," she whispered, her voice steady despite the tears, "will you take me home?" The simple request carried the weight of everything that had just happened, everything that would never be the same, and everything that mattered more than expensive weddings and social expectations. I nodded without hesitation, linking my arm through hers as we turned toward the ballroom exit. Her wedding dress rustled against the marble floor as we walked, but she moved with her head held high, every step a declaration of independence. The first person to clap was the elderly gentleman in the navy suit, the one who had nodded at me earlier when I was still sitting humiliated at the table. His applause started slow and deliberate, each clap measured and meaningful, and within seconds it was picked up by his wife, then by the couple at the next table, then by half the ballroom. The sound built like thunder, rolling across the elegant space in waves that seemed to shake the crystal chandeliers. This wasn't polite wedding applause. This was something rawer, more honest, the sound of people who had witnessed genuine courage and wanted to acknowledge it. I felt my chest tighten with emotion as we walked through that wall of sound, Emily's grip on my arm tightening with each step we took toward freedom. Ryan stood frozen in the middle of it all, his mouth hanging open as he watched his bride walk away to thunderous applause. The man who had controlled every aspect of this evening, who had orchestrated my humiliation with such calculated cruelty, now looked smaller somehow, diminished by the judgment of people who had seen his true character revealed. His expensive tuxedo hung on his frame like a costume he no longer knew how to wear, and his face cycled through expressions of disbelief, rage, and something that might have been panic, as he realized that his carefully constructed world was collapsing around him. Several guests at his immediate table had stopped clapping entirely, their faces reflecting the kind of second-hand embarrassment that comes from being associated with someone who has fallen from grace so spectacularly. "Emily, you can't just leave!" Ryan's voice cracked as he finally found words, but they came out as a shout that only served to make him look more desperate and out of control. "What about the reception? What about the honeymoon? What about everything we planned?" His questions hung in the air like accusations, but Emily didn't even slow down, let alone turn around to address them. The guests closest to him were actually stepping away, creating a physical buffer between themselves and his mounting hysteria. I could see some of them exchanging glances that spoke volumes about how quickly Ryan Blake had gone from being a desirable social connection to a liability they wanted to distance themselves from as rapidly as possible. Richard Blake watched his son's meltdown with the kind of stoic resignation that comes from years of military service and personal disappointment. His face was carved from stone, showing nothing of whatever emotions might be churning beneath the surface, but I could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his hands remained clenched at his sides. Nancy had resumed her seat, but kept her back ramrod straight, her expression making it clear that she was already calculating the damage control that would be required to salvage what remained of the family reputation. The other Blake relatives were whispering among themselves, their body language suggesting they were planning their own strategic withdrawals from what had become a social disaster of epic proportions. As we reached the ballroom entrance, Emily paused for just a moment to look back at the chaos we were leaving behind. Ryan was still standing in the middle of the dance floor, his arms spread wide, as if he couldn't understand how his perfect evening had spiraled so completely out of his control. The scattered rose petals and abandoned wedding rings on the nearby table caught the chandelier light like evidence of dreams that had died violent deaths. The guests were still clapping, but some were also pulling out phones, their expressions suggesting they were already composing messages to share this incredible story with friends and family who hadn't been fortunate enough to witness it firsthand. The wedding that was supposed to establish Ryan Blake as a man of importance had instead revealed him as someone unworthy of the very name he carried. We stepped through the heavy oak doors into the marble lobby, and the sudden quiet felt like stepping into another world entirely. The contrast was jarring, from the thunderous applause and barely contained chaos of the ballroom to the hushed elegance of the hotel's reception area, where uniformed staff pretended not to notice the bride in the torn wedding dress walking past with her father. Emily's heels clicked against the polished floor as we made our way toward the exit, each step taking us further from the disaster that had been her wedding day, and closer to whatever uncertain future awaited us both. The lobby's mirrors reflected our progress, showing me glimpses of my daughter's profile as she walked with the kind of dignity that couldn't be taught or bought. "I'm sorry I didn't see it sooner," Emily whispered as we reached the main entrance, her voice so quiet I had to lean closer to hear her. The admission carried 27 years of trust, the weight of a daughter who had always believed her father saw the world clearly, and wondered why she hadn't trusted that vision when it came to the most important decision of her life. You protected me even when you were humiliated, even when I couldn't see what you were protecting me from. Her voice broke slightly on the last words, and I could feel her body trembling with the aftershock of everything that had just happened. The doorman stepped forward to open the heavy glass doors for us, his expression carefully neutral despite the obvious drama of the situation. I stopped walking and turned to face her fully, my hands finding her shoulders as I looked into her eyes. Eyes that were so much like her mother's, it sometimes took my breath away. "I promised your mother I'd always keep you safe," I said, my voice rough with emotion but steady with certainty. Today, I kept that promise. The weight of those words settled between us like a bridge across the chaos we'd just escaped, connecting us to something deeper than wedding disasters and social embarrassments. Martha's presence felt almost tangible in that moment, as if she was standing there with us in that elegant lobby, proud of the daughter she'd raised and the father who had never stopped fighting for her happiness, even when it meant swallowing his own pride. Emily smiled through her tears, the first genuine smile I'd seen from her all evening, and nodded as she squeezed my hand. "She would have been proud of both of us tonight," she said, and I knew she was right. Martha would have been proud of Emily for having the courage to walk away from a mistake, and proud of me for enduring humiliation with dignity until the truth finally came to light. As we stepped out into the cool evening air, leaving behind the wreckage of what was supposed to be the happiest day of her life, I realized that sometimes the greatest gift a parent can give their child is showing them it's never too late to choose dignity over convenience, truth over comfort, respect over security.